All right. Welcome to the talk, Games User Research, uh, by me, Ben Taels, and here's the fancy branding of my uh, new company that I launched today, where I'm going to provide consultancy on games user research to folks who need it. As a first step here, all images and video in this presentation belong to their respective copyright holders. I've taken them from public sources and so on. Just want to make that clear up front. About me, I'm originally from Tiamuru. I've been a lot of different things in the past, including Director of User Experience Research at Epic Games, before I moved back to New Zealand. I have a PhD in Human Factor Psychology, around 12 years experience in the games industry in UXR, and I've helped ship around 90 games plus 36 seasons of Fortnite Battle Royale, plus a bunch of seasons of other Fortnite platform products. So, uh, getting straight into it, what is user experience research? The kind of book definition of it is a person's perceptions and responses that result from the use or anticipated use of a product, system, or service. This makes it really broad. It's basically from the moment you hear about a product, your experience of that through using a product to the point that you stop. Um, this means there's lots of factors that go into what user experience is, and it means that it tends to be kind of everyone's responsibility to create a good user experience or a user experience you want people to have. So, with that in mind, what is games user experience research and why do it? Why a penguin? We'll get to that later. So, generally speaking, when you're making a product, a game, you have, as the developer, you have your past experiences, your motivations, your knowledge, preferences, your skills, capabilities, and whatever your current mental state is. And these go into an intended experience you'd like people to have. This then gets filtered through the kind of harsh realities of the environment in which you're working in, the tools and software you have access to, the hardware, the time, the money, the organization you're working in, and out the other side will come a game of some shape. You'll then play that and have the developer experience of playing it. In this case, you wanted a duck, you got a rubber ducky, it's pretty close, but not quite what you wanted. So you tend to iterate on the product and then you keep going and keep iterating until you have reached the point where your intended experience is also the experience you're having when you're playing the game, using the product, whatever it might be. This is great. It's super valuable. A really important part of this whole process is doing this. Um, but there are some issues with it. So let's get into those. First of all, you're not all of your players. You are an expert in your game, and you are an expert in game design. And these really matter because the way that we perceive the world is not like a video camera, is not like a computer or a program. Our perception of the world is both bottom up and top down, which means it can be impacted by our past experiences and our current state. Some really easy examples of that is probably you read this as, what if I told you read the first line wrong? Same with the second and also the third. But what is actually written here is what I if told you, you the read first line wrong, same the with second and also the third. The reason this works is that because you're an expert in English and in reading, your brain is processing what's coming, the signals that are coming in through the eyes, to what it expects to read, not what is actually there. Similarly, another example is this, which is the fact that you can read this text shows the way that our brains process written text. Despite the fact that the inside letters of each word are mixed up, it's still possible to understand most words in this piece of text. This is something, again, that many people can do if you happen to be an expert in reading English and so on. In human perception is able to handle these things, but it becomes a problem when you are an expert in your own product, thing that you've made. You may experience it in the way you intend to, but not the way that someone else would when they don't have your background, they don't have your experience with the product. You also likely have different experiences of games overall outside of your own games. As just a quick example, these are the input devices I grew up with playing on Atari and Mac. The games I played as an early kid, with Spider-Man on the Atari and Moonstone on the Amiga and the original Marathon on the Mac. You likely have completely different experiences than I do. Your players have different experiences. It's going to color the way that they play your game and experience your intended experience. You also likely have different abilities, and this is where accessibility can come into things. Um, this example from Microsoft, I think, is a really good one that breaks out that accessibility can be permanent, like we often think of accessibility challenges, things like being deaf or being blind. But it can also be temporary, such as if you have an arm injury and suddenly have to play one-handed or can't use a controller in the way that you're used to using it, or it can be situational. The example of a situational one here under the here matrix is a bartender in a noisy environment. This is actually quite common in games that people are playing in less than ideal audio environments. And it's one of the reasons why Fortnite has the audio visualizer that you can see around the player here as an arc showing the direction of certain sounds. This was originally designed as a situational accessibility tool for mobile players because it's very common on mobile for people to play either without sound or in sound environments that are not ideal. So quite a lot of shooters and other mobile games offer some kind of replacement for audio that lets people play. It was relatively soon added into the full product of Fortnite, and nowadays is on by default for all players. And the great thing about this is it helps people with a range of different accessibility needs. And from a situational accessibility point of view, it's really fantastic because it means you can be having conversations with your friends and talking with them, and you're not missing out on critical gameplay information while you're doing that. You don't have to tell them to shut up or be quiet, and you can play in a room where you have to be quiet and so on. So with that in mind, we've got this idea of the developer having an intended experience, going through the environment, producing a game, and in this case, it goes to the player and the environment that they're in, and they have their player experience, a penguin when you wanted it to be a duck. User experience research can come in here and filter this fact that the player experience is not lining up back to the developer and also to the environment that they're in, depending on the situation. If there's a big organization to feed this back into to say, hey, we need more time or whatever it might be. Then they can iterate, and maybe this time you get a goose. It's closer to a duck than a penguin, and so on. This time getting that rubber ducky, and iteration can continue with this feedback loop until you get to the point that you have the intended experience also being the player experience. A alternate outcome of working with user experience research can also be, say, if you end up in the situation where you're intended a duck and the player experience is a penguin, maybe in finding that out from user experience research, you decide there's some things about penguins as a player experience that you quite enjoy, and it may lead you to having a wonderful penguin duck hybrid as your intended experience. And then you can do the testing to make sure that that is also the player experience or whatever the appropriate methodology is. An example of this would be rocket riding in Fortnite. This was not an intended experience that you could ride on top of bazooka shots and other explosives in the game, but it is something that players discovered they could do, and it became an iconic part of the game. It's on loading screens, and it's something that was never, I guess, fixed as a bug, if you could view it as that, and became a fun experience for players to have. So overall, Games Your Experience aims to conduct research to see if the intended experience is being translated from designer to player. And the three kind of big things that are being looked for there is confirm the intended friction and experiences. One of the really cool things about working in games user research from my perspective is that games are allowed to be difficult. They're allowed to get in the way. They're allowed to make you feel sad or frustrated or whatever it might be. Your microwave isn't really able to do that. So if you're working in user experience on a website or these things, you tend to just remove all the friction. In games user research, we want to confirm that the friction that you as a game designer want to be there is there. What we don't want is unintended or unwanted friction and experiences. So that's what we're looking for from the kind of negative side of things. A game could be intended to be really hard, but it's usually not supposed to be hard to go and change your video settings or whatever it might be. And also to help find unexpected positive experiences. That would be situations like the rocket riding we're talking about, or other things like that. An important part of games user research should be those things too, and to confirm that the things that are working are working. This can happen from ideation with concept surveys, which goes back to the idea of anticipated use, design. You can do design even with paper or digital prototypes, and production all the way to post-launch and live operations, that kind of thing. And importantly, this data is to inform and not drive decision making. I do like to stress that as an important outcome. Data tends to be very reactive and short-sighted. Uh, and if you're driven by data, it can lead you down paths that are not great in the long term. Whereas if data can be used as part of your decision making, along with other processes that you're doing and other ways of looking at it that you have as a designer, it tends to give better long-term results. In addition, games user search ultimately will save you resources, money, and time. Um, if you can do research early and catch problems before you've committed a lot of resource down a certain path, then that'll be cheaper than doing it late, both in terms of money and time. It can help reduce risk in the marketplace and can, in some cases, help you get funding and sales. Some publishers will look for this kind of thing to have been done or ask for it to have been done before they can say that they want to commit to backing your game. So this is my idea of why this is good, but let's also hear from developers.
There's this term that gets floated around, which is that games are played, not made. There is no game design without playtesting. It's a fundamental part of that loop. You're first starting off and it's terrible. The reaction you get is like, cool, good job, bro. And then they walk off awkwardly, right? And that evolves into actually like a frustration because there's something there and they want more from the experience, but you're not quite giving it to them. And by the time we've been working with code centers to Gamescom, the experience that we were getting at that point was people would sit down for 20 minutes, lock in, silence. They're not saying anything. They get up, they turn around and be like, that was sick.
Okay, so there we go. There's a developer putting forward the value here. So that's what it is. For for the rest of this talk, I'm going to focus on how to do it, which is a lot more complicated. I'm going to go through a lot of things here, but I'm going to try and hit the main points and the important points. The first point is that you really need to understand what the intended experience of the game designer or designers is and what the questions are. So this makes games user research a very collaborative partnership when it works best. So for simplicity, I had the arrows only going one way in these previous diagrams, but in reality, there's feedback loops going in all the directions. The developer is talking back to the games user experience researcher to make sure that the methodology is correct, the answers are what they need, and who the intended audience is, and so on. So in terms of general principles, when you're going into this process, you want to know what you want to know. What is your intended experience? What are the outcomes that you expect to see from your game? Who is your game for? A lot of people like my game is for everyone. Very few games ultimately end up being for everyone. There's usually uh, people in terms of past gameplay experiences or other media that they consume that will work better with your game than not. Make it clear that the game is being tested in all these situations, not the player. You don't want people to feel like you're evaluating them. You're evaluating the design so you can get feedback on it. Testing early and testing often tends to be one of the most stereotypical things that game user researchers will say, but that's because we've all had heartbreaking experiences working in games user research where someone contracted us to do a test a week before launch and something is fundamentally broken with a game that can't be fixed at that point. And testing early and doing iterative testing would have solved that problem. So it tends to be very, very valuable. It is also hard to do. I recognize that, but it tends to pay off in the long run. You want to pay attention to issues, but don't necessarily listen to solutions. It's a very human thing when hitting a problem to offer solutions, and players will often do that. But as an expert in game design and in your own game, often you really want to know, well, why is that solution being offered? What's the core issue? And then work out yourself what might be the best solution to get around that. And also, you should not forget to highlight what works and is awesome. Games user research tends to get a bad reputation as just the people that show up and criticize everything. But good games user research should also be saying, yeah, that experience is coming through. It's awesome. It works. People love this part of it, understand this part of it, whatever it might be. In terms of methodologies, there's a lot to get through. These are the ones we'll go through today. We'll go on varying levels, and some of them build on top of each other, so don't need too much repeating between them. But I'm going to go through the common methods where I'll spend most of the time and briefly cover some of the rarer methods. And then there's a method I strongly recommend never using, which is focus groups. So competitive analysis is the first one. A competitive analysis typically comes in two flavors. You're essentially looking at competitor products to understand them and what the player expectations might be. This can be a deep dive, so this would deeply investigate one game and understand what makes it work at this certain time and moment. Say if a game has just launched and there's a lot of people playing it or hasn't done so well, maybe investigating it, understanding deeply what its systems are, what its mechanics are, and so on, and highlighting what is potentially good and bad UX about it. Then there's a comparative study. This one tends to be wider ranging. You might look at 20 games, 30 games, and you'd be looking typically at one specific component of them. So, for example, you're maybe thinking about adding a crafting mechanic to your game, and you want to see how the most popular crafting games handle that. And you'd go through and you'd be looking at things like, well, how many of these let you craft out in the wild? How many of them make you go back to a base? How many of them give you all the instructions up front? How many make you discover them? These kind of things and grouping them together and then trying to see patterns between them. Okay, the ones that make you let you craft out in the wild, they tend to have these restrictions and these outcomes versus the other ones. Another valid one would be this example. So there's 8 minutes there of the AK-47 being fired across various games. Obviously, it's a popular weapon that shows up in a lot of games, but doing a competitive analysis, even on just that, can be very helpful if you are considering putting in AK-47 in your game and you want to see how different animations and sounds change the way that the gun feels from a gameplay perspective. So how do you do a competitive analysis? Well, you select the game or games, you set up a note sheet. I'll give an example of that a little bit later, but typically speaking, a note sheet should have some timestamps in it. It should have a section for where you say what part of the game you're looking at the time when making a note, and a flag to say, hey, are you noting something positive, issue, or just a comment about something going on? You want to set up recording. OBS Studio is extremely good for video recording. Greenshot is a screenshot tool I like. The Windows does fine nowadays with print screen. And you really want to record everything. Your memory won't work to hold everything in it, and it will suck to have to go back. And in some games, you simply can't go back. In some games, something happens, particularly in onboarding, it happens once. There's no way to re-access it. So being able to record everything will be massively valuable in these situations. You also want to play methodically. You want to take your time. The goal is to analyze, not to be natural. You want to understand this game and you want to understand the intended experience of it. If you just play naturally, there's a chance that you don't understand a mechanic and you get a read on a game that is incorrect. As such, it can be very helpful to supplement playing the game yourself if you're going to do it that way with looking at outside sources, things like wikis, streams, videos on demands, like new user experience guides for the game. The game UI database is fantastic for looking at screens. If you don't already use that, you definitely should if you're interested in UI. And these can help bolster a competitive analysis and sometimes mean that you don't even have to play the game yourself because there's enough out there to really understand how it works. So that's competitive analysis. We're going to move on to observation via tests or play tests, UX tests or play tests. This is um, the kind of most effective methodology for UX research. All these other methodologies are great and they have certain places depending on what your research question is, but this is the gold standard, the absolute best thing for most goals within user research. But obviously, it's all about selecting the right methodology. It's referred to as playtesting or UX testing. That just tends to depend on which company you're at. At Epic, we called it UX testing, but playtesting is probably the more common term. And the important thing about it is it's focused on actual in-game behavior. That's writing down what the player does in the game and how the game responds to it is the most important information you can get. Body language and facial expressions are not the focus and often be very misleading. A lot of people don't really change their facial expressions very much when playing, and body language is not as universal as a lot of people think it is. Typically, it's small sample size, usually like 5 to 8 players, or if you're doing big multiplayer, maybe it gets up into the 20s or 30 players, but it's typically not appropriate for sentiment, such as fun or purchase intent. You often will pair it with a survey or interviews for follow-up and context to get deeper understanding of the behavior you're seeing, but the focus of this is behavior. This is an example of how the UX lab looked at Epic Games back in 2014. You obviously don't need a space like this. In this situation, there's a bunch of cubicles with barriers here, so players can't see each other, can't interrupt each other, or get clues from each other. It's dampening the sound between each player. They can sit here and can be observed from this observation room back here with a one-way mirror. If I was making a lab nowadays, I wouldn't bother with the one-way mirror. Everyone kind of knows what they are. It means you need to sit in the dark. It means there's sound travel problems between the two rooms. You can get really good value just running video from the lab room into the observation room. The advantage of that too is you're sitting right at a screen looking at video at exactly what the player is also seeing. Whereas with a mirror, you're kind of having to peer, in this case, up at these screens up the top that are mirroring the gameplay. But generally, the idea is you want to set up a space that's relatively isolated for the player and a space where you can comfortably observe them. This is an example playtest video from the oldest publicly available footage I can find of a playtest of Fortnite. This is maybe 14, 15-year-old video of the very early version of Fortnite. This is the PvE game, now known as Fortnite Save the World. But even some things here will look familiar to even the modern Fortnite Battle Royale. You can see the gameplay is here as the main focus, and there is a camera and a lab photo up here with the player. This is a more modern, but still a few years old example of how the setup at Epic looks. Here, the camera's been shrunken down to be a little bit smaller in this case. Again, we're not really focused on this. The camera is mainly just there to check that the player is seated and doing what they need to be doing. The gameplay is here. There's some branding. Importantly, there's the date that this test was and the time that it was. So this can be matched back to any notes that are being taken of what time to go to in the video to match up with your notes. Which player we're looking at, it's UX2. Down here, because this is being composited together in OBS, we have a tool that lets us see which buttons and sticks are being used on a controller as they're playing. And so we don't need to do anything like put cameras on people's hands, which used to be the solution back in the day where you didn't have this. And then there's just a couple of notes on here that we are recording and streaming. These are mainly just for the people running the test to know that these have been turned on and haven't been forgotten. So you can also test prototypes, as I mentioned earlier. So here's an example of a relatively high fidelity interactive prototype that you could make in something like Figma. This is a paper doll type system for cosmetic customization of an outfit. You can also test gray box type digital prototypes, looking for things like this is particularly useful for usability of interfaces and can people do certain tasks inside of them. And you can even test things as basic as this is a little game design system built together as a script in Excel, where a game design loop could be tested here. And again, we could look at players' understanding of it and understanding of what was going on. And we're able to find very solid findings with this, even with this early prototype that carried on up through more high fidelity versions of the system. When you're doing this type of research, you have a few things you need to think about in terms of how you're going to run the study. They can be task-based or open. Task-based is typically used earlier when less of the system is interactive and when testing UI. This is where you will have a set number of things you want people to do, and you'll guide them or ask them to go through those steps, and then you'll see how it goes. Um, Open is typically when there's more of the game and people can play more naturalistically. In this situation, you'll often sit people down and say play as you would at home and see what happens. You can also combine the two. You may do an open test to start with, and then there's a mechanic that they just don't use, and then you can do a task based to focus in on that, or maybe you have an additional question of a prototype to look at. There's moderated or unmoderated. Moderated is when you sit with them or in another room and are right there to take notes. It is more resource intensive, but it allows for more depth because if something's going wrong in the test or there's something you want to focus on, you can change things on the fly if needed. Whereas unmoderated, these tend to be done via online tools such as Playtest Cloud or Antidote or these other testing tools where you set up the task and you kind of put it out onto the internet and people do it and then you get the videos back. They can work when the task is very locked down or you're open with okay with completely open play, which is could mean that people don't even do the thing you want them to do or get completely stuck. You can also do think aloud or naturalistic play. Think aloud is when someone's playing, they're talking about their experience, they're talking about what they're thinking about, how they feel about it. It's useful because it accesses their internal states, which you usually have to ask about later in the moment. It does have some downsides. So if they're playing a action game or a game with a very high mental workload, talking adds to that workload, and it can also feel very unnatural for some people if they're not naturally talkative people or used to talking about what they're doing or thinking. On the flip side, it can also enhance performance. If you are having to talk out loud about what you're thinking, you will often think more about that thing or think more deeply about it than you would if you were just doing it. After all, and often advice if you're stuck on something is like try and talk through it, talk it out. And so you do have to be aware that these biases can happen in a think aloud session. It doesn't mean think aloud is not valid. It's still a very useful tool. It just, you need to understand that there may be outcomes that wouldn't have occurred if they're just playing naturalistically. Naturalistic usually gets more representative data, but again, you miss out on this kind of internal experience as they play. So to do this, you want to create appropriate tasks if you're using them. You want a test script, which means you should generally write out how you want the test to go and instructions to ensure clarity and consistency. So if you give instructions to the player, you want them to be given the same way for every single player. So you're not changing the output because you happen to tell one person to do something in a completely different way than you told the other person. You want to make sure that whatever instructions you provide are realistic, and same with the task, and do not provide too much information. I've been asked to do tests for people sometimes, and the developer's like, okay, well, before the test starts, they have to read the 6-page game design document about what our intent is, what the storyline is, and what all the controls are. And that's just unrealistic to what the game will environment when they'll sit down. So you want to try and aim for, I'm providing information that I believe the game is also going to provide to this point, or if you're testing the early experience, this is the onboarding I intend to design and it's not there yet, and try and get as close to that as possible. You want to create a note sheet. I'm going to show an example of that on the next page and write exactly what you observed. Don't make guess at emotions, thoughts, and feelings. So you shouldn't say the person was frustrated, or they were stuck, or they were unhappy. You should just write what you saw actually happen. So they were crying, they threw the controller across the room, they jumped across the jump multiple times and didn't make it across. And set up recording. OBS again is used basically in nearly every UX lab across the entire industry for this. It's super configurable. It can composite lots of different sources together, and it is wonderful for recording UX test sessions. So this is an example time step script. It's extremely basic, and I've filtered it in a little bit, but it's got a little bit about the player up the top here. They're a Fortnite player, recently completed a couple of games, and played primarily with keyboard and mouse. Just to get a little bit on who it is, researcher one is making this note on this day at this time with this player. And as each note is being made, there's a script running in Google Sheets here to put a timestamp next to it, so that can be referred back to the video if needed. Then the game section, we're looking at onboarding. It shows a settings pop-up occurs. They turned on subtitles at this point. The play screen, they click the top level tab, return to play, scrolls to mode select, so on. You want to be just taking these notes about what's going on. Um, the goal, even though it does make analysis later on a little bit harder, is to take more notes rather than less. And kind of a gold standard of good playtest notes is someone else that wasn't at the playtest can read it and understand what was going on in that test rather than there being big gaps. Why this is important is if something does go wrong, it's often important to know what the context and situation before that point was and after it as well. And if you only note down where there was issues, you don't have that path to that point. Recruiting players is the next thing. There's a bunch of different ways to do this. Ideally, you want them to be representative, who your audience is. You can use agencies to do this. You can run your own database. There's online recruiting. There's the snowball method, which is where you find somebody and you ask them if they have a friend that also plays those things, because people do tend to play the same games as their friends. You can just do convenience sampling, which would be at a an event or whatever. Obviously, agency or database is probably more representative, and the other way isn't. But there's different ways to do this. You get 10% more than you think you need. That's the usual loss rate from these types of studies in terms of people not showing up. Screen them for representativeness and leak risk if you have concerns around that. One way to screen for leak risk, for example, is to ask them to provide you their social network channels and then go check them. Do they have thousands of followers? Do they, do have their own Discord server? Like these kind of things can be with thousands of people on it. These can be red flags to not let them take part. And a phone screen, even though it takes up a lot of time, is incredibly valuable. Actually talking to someone on the phone means you can react to what they say. You can get a feeling better of are they lying to you or are they confused or misunderstanding something, and you can ask questions like, say, if you want to recruit someone that has played a certain game, you can ask them questions in real time about that game. And there's Gen AI does change this a little bit because it's a bit faster, but there's less chance that they can go away and look it up and come back with the right answer. And you may get into a situation where they often people don't intend to mislead, but they've confused one game with another, and you ask them a question and you can tell, like, well, okay, I wanted someone that had played League of Legends, but this person's obviously talking about Dota or whatever it might be. You want to provide clear information about where to get there, how to test remotely, and how much time it will take. You want to try and use NDAs and consent forms that are legally appropriate to whatever country you're in, and you do want to compensate people for their time. This is, an example of the Epic UX research database. You can probably go see this yourself by going to epicgames.com/, I think, UX. And people can come here and sign up into a database. They answer a few questions in a survey and then can be selected for future testing. You can see the page kind of says how this is going to work, what the requirements are. You have to be 18 plus and live in the United States, and you have to have high-speed internet if we're going to do remote testing, and how it's going to function if you get invited. During the test, you want it to be somewhere neutral, secure, and without distractions. At a lot of game companies, they make sure to bring testers in the least boring way into the studio as possible. So not past the huge big statues and all the fun stuff, but like, okay, round the back into the lab or whatever it might be. If possible, get someone who's neutral to test for you, which is obviously the advantage of working with a researcher. But you can also do this with somebody you know or another game developer who has less invested in the game, so the players may not feel like they need to not hurt that person's feelings, but also can mean that the person who's running the test can be more objective about what they're seeing because they don't have the expectations of how the game functions. Um, Make it clear you want the players to be honest. You can try and break the tension. People often feel a bit nervous coming into these situations. I would usually swear extensively because in the South they don't really swear very much, and doing that makes people relax. Don't be judgmental. You really want to make it clear you're testing the game and not them. Maintain neutral re interest. You do want to show your interest, so you shouldn't look bored and don't react. I've seen test situations where the tester is laughing at a player getting in a bad situation. It's just not a good scene. I don't know. What do you think it does? X does is a really valuable answer to questions. It will often cause the person to rethink and reframe the way they are thinking about the situation they're in, and that'll give you more information than them just asking, what does this button do, or whatever. It'll get them in the more analytical mode of thinking and get you more information about what's going on. You should not step in and help or provide information unless people are really, really stuck. I have gone to lots of situations at conferences and things like that where I sit down to play a game that's on the show floor, and the game developer is immediately at my shoulder telling me all the ways to play the game, everything I need to do, and so on. That's fantastic if all you want from the situation is someone to have fun with your game, but if you're also using the situation to see how people react to the game from a user experience perspective, then giving all this information ahead of time that is not going to come with the game is going to bias things. You can use a rage quit signal, so this can be as easy as someone putting up their hand if they would have rage quit the game, and at that point you can note it down, but force them to continue playing if you don't think they're super struck. Or if you've already recognized there's a bug or something that's a really serious blocker, let people play up to there, see if they somehow manage to get through it, but if they don't, you can quickly move them on. Again, only write what you observe. Don't assume I'm repeating that because it's really important. You should use surveys, interviews to get additional details. Getting to the end of this, I know it's a lot, but after the test, you want to compensate players and remind them of any NDAs. You often want to frame this in a way that makes it feel like it's a benefit to the player to not talk about the situation. So things like, thank you so much for coming. It's so great. We can make the game better with you and continue to have future opportunities to do this. So you're implying that, if they go out and talk, they're not going to get to come back and get paid like they just did and have the experience they just did. You should save the videos and images somewhere safe with clear file names. Establish a consistent file name process here will save you a lot of time later. I typically like year, month, day, the name of the game and the name of the player, and sometimes even at the end, like purpose of the test. And you want to summarize your notes, supplement with interviews or surveys, and look for positives, things that worked. Criticals, that should be a thing that completely blocked process or completely put someone on the wrong path. A medium should be something that breaks process or breaks flow. So it didn't completely stop the experience, but it really severely broke it in some way. And then low is like bumps, things that got in the way, but didn't really stop the experience getting to where it needed to go. These just help to, categorize the issues and focus when there's later discussions about what needs to be fixed and doesn't. And you shouldn't focus too much on how many people hit each issue at the small sample sizes here, even and the type of issues you're looking at. Even in one person hitting a critical issue can be quite meaningful. Sentiment, on the other hand, as mentioned, doesn't usually hold very much at these points, but these kind of usability and UX issues that are fundamental to human perception and memory are detectable at low sample sizes and can be very meaningful. As a quick aside, you can nowadays do this type of testing. You don't need a lab. You don't need to go out and do these things. And tools like Parsec and Zoom are incredibly useful for it, and it can integrate into OBS. From the player's perspective, all they do is join a Zoom call and sign up to Parsec, and suddenly you're streaming the game to them. It's really fantastic because it means they haven't installed your game, they don't have access to it, they can't keep it after it's done or do any data work on it, and they don't have to download it or spend the time installing it, all this stuff. They just join a stream and it is streaming to them. You do want to screen participants for internet speed. And this is a biasing factor of remote observational research in that obviously you're only a certain type of person has fast internet, so you are biasing your sample, but at the same time you're broadening your sample outside of people in your immediate area that you could potentially bring into a lab. You also want to look at extra security steps such as ID checks. They show an ID to show that they are the person you recruited, keeping the screen blank whenever they're not playing, and camera checks, which is something like when they join, they lift up their camera and show that they're alone in the room, and if they're ever joined by somebody else, you cut the feed, those kind of things. Ultimately, in my experience, remote research is as secure as doing research in a lab because the most critical thing for security of a playtest is who you invite in the first place and not necessarily the situation it's in. But it is worth adding these additional checks to make it clear to the player that, we take this seriously and this is a private situation. So ultimately, that's the end of observational research. But everything I've talked about here is like how to do the best and most unbiased, how a researcher would do this. However, even running a test yourself at a conference or with family and friends can still be incredibly valuable. This is such an important tool. I would say if you're going to do anything, the three most important things is record everything because you really want to go back and be able to show that moment to people and check that moment. Did you see what you thought you saw? Did that situation really happen? Use an organized note sheet and only write what you see, and be neutral as possible and don't help people. And these are the three things that will kind of get you the best results. All right. So that's the behavior. You will want to know access to what they're thinking, how they're feeling. And so the methods for doing that is interviews and surveys. To start with interviews, they're often combined with observation. They're interactive, they access internal cognition and reasoning, and they allow for you to follow up. People can say something and you can react to that and ask additional questions. However, they're really time intensive. They're usually a small sample size, which makes them inappropriate for representative sentiment of fun and things like that, but they can give extra context to observations. You can understand the whys behind the behavior that you saw better if you can get this information. They are what people say, which is less reliable than what they do, their behavior. You want to be careful about biases there. Ways to avoid that is you should ask about past behavior, not future intent. Best predictor of what people do in the future is what they've done in the past. If you're asking a kind of unclear question about what would you do about this in the future, in the current situation they're in, they could say things that don't necessarily hold up. You want to be neutral and don't lead people. You want to listen empathically. I do want to spend a little bit of time on empathic listening because it's super valuable both in research but also in just life. Um, Empathic listening is when you give people undivided attention. In some cultures, that would be making eye contact. You do have to be careful, though. In other cultures, eye contact, particularly in a situation where people feel there's a power dynamic, can be disrespectful. But you want to give a signal that you are paying attention to somebody. You want to listen to both facts and feelings that they're putting out. Be not judgmental. That doesn't mean be bored, but it doesn't mean that it means you don't react in negative and judgmental ways to what is said. Show you listen carefully. This is things like nodding, short verbal reassurances like uh-huh, mm-hmm. And restating and paraphrasing is a real superpower, which is someone will tell you something like, I couldn't work out how to open the door. And you can say, okay, so it wasn't clear how to open the red door. And by restating and paraphrasing, it gives them an opportunity to tell you that, yes, you understood what they're saying, but also to add additional context without you asking questions, which may end up biasing or leading them in their response. You should also not be afraid of silence. People often fill silence with additional information after they've made a statement. Obviously, you don't want to make it too awkward or judgmental, but a nice, comfortable silence can often be filled with additional information. And then to follow up, which shows you're listening, asking additional questions. Interviews, in terms of how to do them, you want to use a comfortable setting with few distractions. You typically only want one or two people at a time, usually only one. As soon as you get multiple people, you start getting group biases and other things like that that can be very difficult to control. But in some situations, you're going to have to do two people. Say you're doing a parent and their child, or situations like that where it's not appropriate for you to be alone with somebody. You want to get permission to record the interview because you won't remember anything. And if possible, you don't want to be taking notes. You either want to go back to your recording or someone else is taking notes, people get intimidated and you'll miss things if you're like taking notes at certain things they say, and then they'll notice when you're not taking notes, these kind of things. Much like with a test, you want to create a script for consistency of how questions are asked. You want to always ask the same question in the same way if possible to not bias the answer. This doesn't mean not to be flexible, though. There will be some situations where people already answer a question you're going to ask, or there's a situation you have to ask in a different way because of the context. But having these there means you won't forget to ask something, you won't accidentally bias the data, and you want to follow the rules of good question design, which we're going to cover in the survey section. Try to avoid simple yes no questions unless stuff was set up of like, did you do this? Yes, and then on. You've got an interview. You don't want a lot of just yes no out of somebody. It's kind of wasted your time and theirs. Um, you do want to, last thing on interviews, you do want to be prepared to gently move people back onto topic. Some people really love to talk, and you'll typically only have a certain amount of time. So you need to gently, non-judgmentally move people back. In a similar way, people often get on solutions. That's okay, but you want to probe on what it is they're trying to solve for and get back to that as a focus. You do, if you've got time, in with the opportunity to add anything you want. This is a chance for them to surprise you potentially by talking about things you hadn't even thought to ask about. And then afterwards, you look for themes and commonalities in addition to how the answers you've given give context to the behaviors that you observed. Surveys is the other really common way to get this data in terms of people's internal states, thoughts, feelings. And here's the way to get representative sentiment at scale. You can send surveys to hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, millions of players. Self-report, so it is biased and vulnerable to memory effects, but it is a way to actually collect representative, here's how I feel, here's how I think, this kind of stuff. That are really easy to make surveys, but that are deceptively difficult to make well. So I'm going to hopefully go over some of the things that will help you be able to make them well. They can be used as part of a UX test to collect clarity and understanding after observation, similar to an interview, and you can kind of paste them within a test. So right after onboarding, you might give a survey that kind of assesses what the first people learned, or after the first level, or right at the end of the 2 hour session, or wherever it is appropriate, depending on whatever your goal is. You can send them via email, but anti-spam laws mean that you do need people to have opted in to receiving those kind of communications from you, or you can get in trouble. You can distribute them online, such as on your socials. In that case, you have a self-selection bias, but there's always self-selection in surveys. It's just understanding how bad that is, and they can be built into the game, which having done this on several games is just incredibly useful because you are surveying people in the moment at the time at which they are having the experience, and you can get much more accurate data there. The downside of built into the game is they do generally have to be relatively simple because you don't want to interrupt your gameplay too much with a survey. And if they're being asked on a console or whatever, it has to be quick. Um, so you do want to think careful about the order of your questions when you're designing a survey. So does an early question you ask give an answer to a later one? This can be easy to do by something like maybe you have an early question that asks people to rate how they felt about all the different mechanics in your game, and you happen to mention a mechanic they had no idea that it exists. And then later on, you want to understand if they know about this mechanic, while you maybe even revealed it to them earlier. So you do need to think about, hey, as I'm writing these, am I giving people information that maybe I want to ask about later, and what order we want this in? Before and after questions can be useful. So before they've done something in a lab, and then after they've done it. And unprompted and prompted is useful. I'm going to give an example of that. This would be an unprompted question where you're showing someone a screen or an interface and saying, is there anything unclear here? If so, please explain below. This gets kind of like a first impression, high top of mind information. Then you can follow it by a more prompted, restricted question where it's like, hey, please describe what each of the items below mean. If it's not clear, just write not clear. And then you're like A, B, C. And what you'll often see in these situations is, say in this one, they're like, oh, everything's clear, I understand everything. And then they've never seen C before in their entire life and they have no idea what it is. But getting that comparison point between the two of them can give you some valuable information as you look through the answers to this in a UX test. You do want to use clear, concise, simple language. This is really important because if they don't understand what you're asking, or they think you're asking something you're not, then their answer is completely useless to you, and you may not even know that. Much like when you're making a game, you have an intended experience and then the player experience. When you're making a survey, you have an intended survey experience and then the survey taker's experience, and those need to line up. So being really clear, concise, and simple will increase your odds of that happening. You do not want friction in a survey, whereas you may want it in a game. Don't ask about intent, ask about past behavior. I've talked a little about this previously. If someone's sitting on the toilet with their phone taking a survey, it's really easy for them to say, yeah, I'll play this game in the future, or yeah, I'd buy it. But when a month or two down the line, they have a low amount of money in their bank account, these kind of situations completely change what they intend to say. So you should ask about what they've done in the past. It's much more predictive of what they'll do in the future. When you're designing them, you do have some choices around statements versus questions. Questions are good for gaining information. So, how fun was this? Um, what have you done in the past? Questions about their experiences. Statements are for assessing attitudes. So, it's agreement with an idea. We've probably all filled in strongly agree to strongly disagree scales where it has a statement and then you're expected to agree with that. It's the main difference here. They're both fine. It's just depending on what you want to know. Closed versus open. Closed questions are where all the answers are already there. You don't have to write anything in. They're faster, clearer, and they're great when you already know what you want to ask. You should try to have nearly all your questions be closed if you can manage. The reason for this is while open do allow for discovery, so you can find out things you don't know and give people opportunity to add additional information. They're really time consuming for you to analyze, but also for the person to write in. People often are really bad at filling in open-ended. They'll write like, yeah, it was hard, but not tell you anything or give you any of the information you really wanted to know. And I've never actually seen this happen, but my lawyer friends would be upset if I didn't mention it. Open-ended can carry legal risks if someone tells you information that you, as a company, have an obligation to pass on to authorities or take action on under laws, then that carries a risk of having an open-ended where someone can write something in. Again, never seen it happen. This tends to be a risk only when you're doing very big surveys, but it is something to consider. In terms of scales, you have several options. The most simple is a dichotomous scale where there's only two options. This is yes, no, true, false. They're very direct, they're very precise, easy to answer, but they're not super data rich, but they can be useful. So here's an in-game survey in Fortnite. Did you have fun in the last game? Yes, no. You can monitor the percent of the answers to that over time. It tells you how things are going as you change things in the game. Continuous, place a mark along a continuum. This is a lot more data rich. Here it's being used of 1 month to 24 months, but it can't be too precise with unclear rating. Say if it's a rating of 0 to 100 of fun, what does an 84 mean versus an 89? Did you need that much resolution in your scale? These kind of things are questions you should be thinking about. Then there's interval. These are probably the most common that you've probably seen a lot. They tend to be the 1 to 5 or 1 to 7 scales. Typically speaking, a 1 to 5 is something you use in a smaller sample size, and a 1 to 7 is something you use in a larger sample size where you want more room for resolution of answer. And these can be numeric of just the numbers, unipolar, which would be when it goes from not something to something, so not exciting to very exciting, or bipolar, the classic strongly disagree to strongly agree. It is really important that each step along the scale has even psychological distance, which is to say, if you think about the strongly disagree, disagree, neutral, agree, strongly agree scale, each of those steps feels even as they move between the steps, and nothing feels like, well, suddenly going from a 4 to a 5 is like way bigger than going from a 1 to a 2. Interval scales are specific, clear, and data rich. They're not always suitable, but the reason they're used so often is they do tend to suit a lot of situations. Here's an example, again, from Fortnite's in-game survey. Please rate how you feel about building, very negative to very positive, with neutral in the middle. People can select this and move on. You can also do single select surveys. This is good when forcing a choice. Pick the best or worst thing about a situation, or when options are exclusive, so you can't have more than one. How long you've been playing Fortnite Battle Royale? A week, a month, a year, whatever. You do often need to remember to offer a clear NA option or not applicable, or I didn't do this, depending on the situation you're asking about. And multiple select is where people can pick more than one thing. It's a richer range of data when options aren't exclusive. So what do you like about Fortnite Battle Royale? Again, you may want to offer a nothing option or a I didn't do this or whatever it might be. So this is an example of a multi-select in-game survey in Fortnite. Again, this is what you dislike. People can select as many as they want out of these nine, and then they can submit it. Finally, for these type things, there's ranked choice. This is obvious. This is sometimes something people want to like get relative importance of things. What's the most important thing to the least? Ranked choice is pretty is good, but it can be pretty restrictive. Generally speaking, people get pretty tired ranking more than five things. Sometimes you can go up to 10, but it's going to get very difficult for people to do, and there may not be a lot of meaning. There's also it can be difficult to get an idea of magnitude of importance. Say if I'm asking you to rank five things and you only think one of them is important, you rank that as one, and then the next four you give a ranking, but you don't really care between the difference between two and five. Whereas maybe someone else thinks that one and two are pretty close together, and then three and four are pretty close together, and then five is like way below. You don't get that information out of ranked choice. An alternative to it is max diff, where people trade off options against each other. This creates a ranking order, and it also creates a magnitude of preference for each item. It takes longer for people to do, and it has an advantage if you can do it with like 30 different objects rather than five in a ranked choice. But it's kind of fun for people to do. Here's an example of it. This is the Fortnite outfit survey, where Epic sends out concept art of outfits, and people have to say what's their most favorite and least favorite amongst a set that's shown to them. Once they've indicated that, a new set will be shown, and it may have some new characters in it and some old ones that they've already ranked. So say we did this again, and the cat stays, but there's a bunch of new ones. Maybe they said cat was the most favorite when compared against Ninja Guy, On Fire, Axolotl, and this lady. But when it's compared against a bunch of others, it's now the least favorite. And by doing this several times, you get a kind of a relative ranking out the end with different points between the two. Sorry, dog just barged in the room. I'm gonna close the door. Oh, there we go. All right. Just quickly gonna do bad surveys. So there's a few things to really look out for. One is leading questions. These are questions that lead people to an answer. This can even be as basic as which level was the most fun, because that implies one of these levels was fun, and maybe none of them were. It is saying most fun, but even here can be a little bit of a difficult situation. A better way of asking this would be just, hey, rate each of the levels and then have them rate them on a scale of not fun to extremely fun or whatever might be appropriate. You also want to look out for double-barreled questions, questions that ask more than one thing. Here's an example of a seven-barreled question. It's not from a game, but it's from a referendum that happened here in New Zealand, where it asked, should there be a reform of our justice system, placing greater emphasis on the needs of victims, providing restitution and compensation for them, and imposing minimum sentences and hard labor for all serious violent offenders? It's a lot of different options. And all you had to say is yes or no. Well, if someone said yes to this, what are they saying yes to? What are they saying no to? Again, simple clarity, so you know that you asked this question this way, they answered it that way, and those things can match, and there's no misunderstanding between the two. Um, Loaded, poorly defined, and misleading is also something to look out for. Loaded means that there's a judgment, a moral judgment, or an emotional judgment built into the survey. There's another referendum question from here in New Zealand. Should a smack as part of good parental correction, that's the loaded part of it, be a criminal offence in New Zealand? Yes or no? This is a bad question. John Key had this to say about it. Could have been written by Dr. Seuss. This isn't green eggs and ham. This is yes means no and no means yes. We're all meant to understand what the referendum means. I think it's ridiculous, and I agree. So finally here, last few things is if you can, use logic branching and extraction to create a flow through your tool. A lot of survey tools do this. So this would be only asking relevant questions. So if you're like, hey, did you do this thing? They then get questions about doing it and how they felt about it and so on. But if they didn't do it, they don't get a bunch of questions that are irrelevant. If you are using open-ended, it can be useful to end with an open-ended, hey, is there anything else you'd like to tell us, good, bad, or otherwise? And then you have three boxes underneath that say good, bad, or other. This makes it easier for the person to fill in, but also make it easier for you to code in the end than just a big box, because you can look in the good box for good things, the bad, and then the other. You do want to test your surveys before sending. Either do a small send, say if you're going to send to 1,000 people, send it to 20 or 30 people, see if everything works, or just internally giving it to someone who hasn't worked on it to go through and see if there's points where the logic is broken or things don't make sense and it's not clear. And finally, if you can, you want to link surveys answers to analytics and metrics. So you can say, like, this person plays in this way and they answer these questions in this. This also means that sometimes you don't need to waste time asking about something in a survey unless it's going to trigger logic because you can already get it from their analytics. So those are kind of the really big ones, and we've spent a lot of time on them. These next ones, not so much time, but I'm going to get through them as common methods and rarer methods. So card sort is a method that's often used for menu and UI organization. You have a bunch of functions and want to see how to group them together. They provide data on how people see those functions and the relationships between them. What do you expect to be in the video section of settings, for example? They can also be generative when working out what options should even be available. What do people expect to see in settings? And then how would you group them? To do this, you want to create an extensive selection of cards and use hopefully clear representative names, unless you're doing this generative thing, and then you can build it with people. In person, this can be useful to talk along, but less representative due to small sample sizes. You do it remote, either via one-on-one using something like Trello, or at scale via online tools. With things like Optimal Sort or some of the other survey tools, you can get thousands of people to do a card sort for you and get really clear representative data, or even split it between different groups. And they can be open or closed, which is open is you give a bunch of different things and people create, oh, I think these should go in three different categories and they should be called these three things. Closed would be you've already defined, okay, there's five different categories. Tell me which things go into those. So you'd be looking at something like a settings screen and you'd write out all these different settings and then ask people which of these settings they think the thing should go into. To give you an idea, this is a very old version of optimal sort, but this is what it would look like for someone doing it in a survey tool where they're like, change the privacy settings they think should be under solo or party, or view all resources should be under inventory, and so on. Next up is UX analysis. This is where a specialist, such as myself, analyzes the game based on their education experience. It's relatively fast, cheap, and can find many significant issues. However, it's not as good as research with actual players. I've done a lot of UX analyses and provided value with them, but there's always been things that in a UX test surprised me or didn't come up in a UX analysis. Whether those things are super significant is a different thing, but that UXS still remains kind of the gold standard. A self-serve version of this would be to look up some UX or usability heuristics and strictly follow them to do analysis themselves, which is making a checklist and saying yes, no, or never to always of these things. What I mean by that is here's some example heuristics. These ones are by Koful et al. Where it's like, hey, is the overall goal, is the player presented with clear goals, easily enough or able to create their own goals and able to understand and identify them, and going through each of those and really trying to objectively look at your game from this perspective and say yes, or yeah, all the time we do this, or sometimes we don't. Another example of this would be to use things like the Microsoft Game Accessibility Guidelines, which are probably the best guidelines out there for making accessible games, and going through these and seeing again if you hit these things of text display, do you have good contrast, do you have subtitles and captions that are accessible, and so on. Last thing in the common methods is metrics and analytics. Metric and analytics are typically their own discipline, but they're often combined with UXR as part of an insights team. Combined, they're more than some of their parts. They tend to be synergetic when working together. Analytics is really strong at giving signals of what is happening and is often representative at scale. But one of the weaknesses analytics tends to have, not always, but tends to have, is it often struggles with why. UXR can help provide that why and then be greatly enhanced and validated via analytics. Maybe you make some changes based on UX tests, and then the analytics can validate that those actually had the outcome that you wanted them to. A quick example, here's maps of where someone was standing when they made a kill on the left and where someone was standing when they were killed by the people making the kills on the left, over here on the right. What type of weapon this is, I'm sure you can make a guess. It's a sniper rifle. So you can see if you're looking at the design of this map, these higher areas here where people have good sight lines to make kills with sniper rifles. And you can see they're able to get these lower areas here, but also there's a bunch of counter sniping going on in the sniper pits between each other. And you could use this information to see if you're happy with how your map is balancing out in this weapon. More UX example is this is a publicly shared example from Fortnite, where in the mobile version of the game, you can customize where your HUD is placed on screen. This is a heat map that showed where people moved elements of the HUD, and you could look at this to say, well, whatever this element is on the left with the brown and this one over here with the kind of red pinky color, people tend to move these into the center of the screen. We may want to investigate why that is, why they don't like it where it is by default, and they're moving it more towards the center. Metrics can be overwhelming, though. You do want to be careful with them. It's easy to get data overload, and there is a lot more subjectivity in analysis than you may expect. People often like analytics are objective, UX testing is subjective. But there's a lot of subjectivity in even choosing what to measure, how it's measured, how the data is filtered, how it's presented. All these things are still, subjective calls. And if you end up with too much data, it can not be useful. So this is one of these is kills, one of these is deaths. It's hard to tell what they are. This data is maybe useful to say, hey, they're both relatively easily distributed, but isn't super useful without being able to filter it down some more. So looking into rarer methods, diary study is where people play your game at home as part of their normal lives and then fill a survey each day or each time they play about the experience, including if they didn't play today, they tell you why. It gathers information on the longer term engagement, and it can also get you some look into naturalistic problems. So it can be a good addition to soft launch or done even before a soft launch. It is very time consuming, but it can be data rich. And I mean, it is very time consuming. It's probably one of the most time consuming methods you can use. There's multiple reasons for this, but you need a larger sample size, and you need to recruit at least 20% more because some people are going to flake out, particularly if you're doing it over a couple of week period. You need NDAs. You want to determine the time frame, and then you want to set up. Typically, you want to do a pre-interview, a short daily survey, often with a longer one on the first day, or even you do observation on the first day, and then for the rest of the time they're doing a diary study. And you want to include an option of why they didn't play, or in some situations in the diary study, you require them to play every day, but you should also add an option of I would have stopped playing if I didn't have to, because it's really important to understand where that break point is in a diary study. You also need to set up daily reminders of whatever the restrictions you have. Fill in your survey today, play today, let us know. And then at the end, you typically want to do a post interview or a longer survey at the end. You do also need to pay them for this larger time commitment. There's specialized tools out there like Playtest Cloud, Dscout, and a bunch of others support it. Playtest Cloud is nice in that you get videos of daily play for you to look at. But there's other tools that also do this. Looking at external play can also be done observationally if you get people in for multiple days. So you can just do a UX test or a play test where people come back every day. Obviously, that tends to be a smaller sample size, but it's a easier commitment. You don't have to remind them every day, but it does take up a lot of time to have people traveling in. With these, you can ask people at a survey what their goals are for the day, what they remember from the day before. Biometrics, last of the rarer methods, they cover a range of methodologies that are aimed at recording physiological signals of arousal, which is intensity of feeling or emotion, or valence, which is the type of emotion. Things like eye tracking, skin conductance, facial expression, heart rate, EEG. Here's a quick example of this. So this is me playing Halo Reach
Slayer.
with heart rate variability being measured. You can see it in the top there. So it starts off relatively low. As the game starts, it starts to spike up. It's a measure of mental workload. And as I get into combat, you can see it gets up
Gain the
to some
lead.
of the higher peaks. And then starts to fall off. And then as workload starts to increase again, it goes up. Not going to show the whole thing, but as you can see, you can kind of map out the behaviors and then a response. Now, biometrics look cool, they look sciencey, but they are very complicated and time consuming. They have a lot of artifacts in them, people moving around, people doing things like that that typically they do to play a game can cause false data to occur. They're invasive. You're collecting a body signal. There's some laws around that in some situations. They can sometimes have ethical issues. If you detect someone has a heart rate arrhythmia because you've set them up, do you now need to tell them that they should go see a doctor? These are situations that have actually happened. And they have significant inference issues, which is to say, our bodies are very complicated. There's lots of reasons why my heart rate variability might change. It could be because of what I just experienced in your game, or it could be because I'm thinking about how much fun I had last night, or I'm worried about something. Um, so they tend to be, if you're going to use biometrics, they're used alongside other methods to triangulate. To show an inference issue, here's a study that claimed that dying is more fun than killing. What happened is when an opponent was killed, the kind of fun was didn't really fall off. So there was skin conductance increase for an opponent being killed. So people's arousal increased. But if you looked at valence, which is in this case measured by facial muscles, being killed had a higher rating than opponent killed. The conclusion here was people are having more fun. An alternate one would be if you're killed, you relax, sit back, and kind of your facial expression changes from the focus that you probably had when you were trying to make the kills. This is because in reality, this is marketing of what people look like when they're playing. This tends to be what people actually look like. They tend to have a very focused expression that only changes occasionally. Eye tracking is a really interesting biometric and worth looking at as an added plus in some situations. It'd be really useful when testing UI. It's kind of an observation aided by technology of someone's gaze. It can also be looked at as a post-test confirmation of where a player looks. So you could see something like this with them looking around a scene. If we look at a video of that, this is me playing Amnesia Dark Descent many, 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 many years ago. You can see it showing where I am looking as I play the game. Here's a heat map generated from me playing a game of Dota 2. You can see a lot of focus on the lane I was in, on the mini map down here and around the center of the lane. And you can even do some analytics on this. There's some issues in that what it measures is where people are looking. And while this is the reality we perceive, this is what the signal actually coming down our optic nerve looks like. There's only a very small amount of your vision that is in focus. Everything else is blurred. Now you can pick up movement and things in this blurry area, and the reason you see the world as all in focus is your brain, your eyes are moving around rapidly, and your brain is basically making up the rest based on expectations and past data that it's being seen. So, what gaze eye tracking measures is where people are looking, but not necessarily where they are paying attention to. It is very easy to look at something and not understand it, not pay attention to it. And you can also uh, see and pay attention to stuff that is not directly that you're looking at. Movement in the edge of your vision can attract attention. Example of this, I'm not sure how many people noticed Godzilla was in the background of the photo before when we were looking about this moving around. Another thing is in 3D games, this shows someone's looking here, but what are they exactly looking at here? There's a bunch of elements all overlapping. You may not, it may not be clear what they were checking out if they tend to be looking in this situation. So, biometrics, if you are going to use them, you need to combine them with observation to understand what it's about. You do need special care with setup to remove artifacts, have a plan what to do if you find troubling data, research the method, and post-process to remove artifacts. As a quick thing, biometrics as gameplay is an interesting thing that hasn't really been solved by anyone, but it's There's some fun ideas out there like using eye tracking to have NPCs react when they're being looked at. This is something you can do in some VR sets, for example. People naturally tend to react when they're looked at or react to eye contact. How would that go within a game setting? And the advantage of using biometrics as gameplay, while there's all these problems with interpreting them as a scientific signal, people are great interpreters and give meanings to things all the time. So just by presenting a biometric signal, you can get players to react to it in interesting ways. So, for example, this is a EEG headset that the ears move depending on the brainwaves it's detecting, although often it will just be detecting muscle movement. So, what if somebody was playing poker and they were wearing one of these? So in this situation, it doesn't matter that that EEG headset is probably really cheap and not accurate up to research levels. It's adding an extra signal that is fun for players. And Valve has experimented with this long ago. They ran games of Left 4 Dead where all they did is put skin conductance up on the screen. So if you're a zombie and you jump somebody, you could see their skin conductance jump up. And Valve reported that adding biometric readings for players to see was one of the most enjoyable things they've ever done with biometrics because people love to see like, oh, I really freaked that person out, or at least that's what they feel they did. All right, I know we're running out of time for questions, but the last one is going to be fast. I recommend never using focus groups or tests. They're effectively a group interview. They're extremely easily biased. What people say is not what they do. Strong voices can dominate them. There's a lot of social desirability impacts both from the people in the group and the moderator. You get group thick issues. Groups have a greater tendency to rationalize and focus on solutions. Moderators can easily bias everyone in the group due to their authority effects, the way they ask questions, how they ask them, how they react. Um, and one thing that makes focus groups really, really dangerous from my perspective is they are bad data, but they are very compelling to watch. We as people find it really compelling to see a group of people discussing something and agreeing on something or disagreeing on something. They have a high truthiness, is one way to put it. And so they're biased, but they feel unbiased, and that makes them quite dangerous. I don't know if people watched this episode of Black Mirror, but it had a situation in it where there was a focus group. Everybody disliked the product. This person in the colorful top here strongly expressed that they liked it, and everyone at the table changed their minds. Now, this was due to sciencey, weird, spooky stuff because it's Black Mirror. Spoilers, sorry. But this can just happen in a focus group. It doesn't need these kind of things. One strong voice can actually change lots of people at the table. So, in terms of how to do it, I really recommend not doing it. So, as a final summary, user experience research is a partner to help inform decision making and confirm the intended experience reaches the player. It's useful as you're not your players, saves you and makes you time and money. It can be done in various ways throughout the game journey. Again, we really encourage you to test early and test often if you can. The kind of high level of how to do it is know your audience and recruit them. Know what your questions are. Select the method that best answers those. At a high level, UX and usability tends to be best answered by observation plus an interview or survey. Sentiment is best answered via surveys, and concept testing is best done via competitive analysis and surveys. There are exceptions to this depending on what you're looking at, but those tend to be kind of very high level recommendations. And every method has its biases and weaknesses. It's more about knowing what those are uh, and what biases you have and taking those into account. So thank you very much. I think we can go to questions now. You can email me, check out my website, follow me on Blue Sky, or hit me up on those gaming platforms.
Great. We've got about or just shy of 10 minutes for questions. If anybody has anything they would like to ask. Dara asks, how much should we pay to testers? How many questions would be appropriate in a survey?
Okay. I'm going to unshare this because I can't see anything. There we go. Um, that's a good question. It's really going to be very dependent on how long you have them testing for and what you're having them do and so on. Generally speaking, you do want to pay them more than minimum wage to make it attractive. There are situations in which you don't want to use real money though, because of tax implications. So you want to use gift cards or other things like that to compensate. Although even those can have tax implications if over a certain amount. So you do need to track how much you're giving. How many questions in a survey? So typical advice is it's going to really depend on the context of that survey. So in a lab, you can add a ton of questions to a survey because you have them trapped in an environment and they have to sit there and do it. If it's in a game, you probably only want like one to maybe four related questions where it's like, hey, how difficult was this? How much fun was it? All these different things all linked together. But you really don't want them, you want them playing your game, not answering a survey. In an email survey, the typical guidance for an email survey is 10 minutes to 15 minutes max. And typically speaking, one question is a minute, although if the items are very closely related to each other, say in a matrix question, people can often do those faster because they're like, oh, I know each one of these is just simply agree, disagree, and I go down them. Um, However, in my experience, if your player base is with game people playing games can answer 30-minute surveys quite happily because they want to tell you about it. Whereas somebody who's being asked a survey about their operating system, they don't care. So you've got just a few questions to get through. Players do tend to care more and can answer quite long surveys. The exception to this is if you're trying to survey churners, because they've already left your game, they don't generally care very much. They might have strong negative opinions, but in those, you want to keep the questions relatively low and you want to front load your most important question, which is usually, hey, why did you leave? What was the problem?
Great. I think we've probably got time for just one more question, unfortunately.
Sorry.
Jack asks, in a setting like PAX or Armageddon, how valid are observations of a player considering how chaotic environment it is? What if anything, what if anything can you learn the people playing? Right. So,
Um, Yeah, I think there are games user researchers that have a very absolutist view on this that you can't learn anything in those situations. I personally disagree. I think if you've got someone to sit down and they're putting headphones in, so they're a bit more isolated from the situation, and they're sitting down at a computer and it's right in front of them, they can lock in and be playing the game and get you relatively valuable observations. The important things will be to like not be providing them too much information and not be prompting them too much. Um, Again, I think it comes down to what's your goal at being at those events. Is it to do a marketing task where you want people to have as much fun as possible, or is it to get this information from people? And there can be a nice balance between those two things, but it will come back down to what your goal is. But I do think I've seen valuable information at them. I've certainly provided valuable information at them to developers. Um, and I think that the video at the start where people are like, "Hey, yeah, cool," and walk away, um, is a very real thing that because you are the game developer that's there, they may not give you as much truth in saying like, "Hey, this sucks," or whatever it might be. But you can still see a variance in their reaction, and what you're mainly looking for again is what is the actual in-game behavior versus what they say or what's on their face or their body language.
fantastic. I think we're going to have to wrap it up there, just because we're conscious of time. Um, are there any last words, Ben?
Um, no, I hope you enjoyed the talk. And as I say, reach out if you have questions. I'm always happy to answer questions both at the email. I'm also in the code Discord and so on. Always very happy to discuss these things.
And remember, there's another session in another couple of weeks,
Hmm.
which you'll be able to attend and ask questions then.
Yeah, that session probably won't take up as much time, I hope. So there could be callback questions to this, and that session is going to focus a lot more on my advice for onboarding new players, both to games in general and to your game specifically.
Thank you so much for everyone for attending, and thank you so much, Ben, for hosting. I hope
Thank you.
everyone has a nice evening. Cheers.